There was a man named Daniel. He was the kind of person who always needed to be in control of his time, his plans, his emotions, even the smallest details of his day. Every morning he made lists. Every evening he checked what went wrong. If things didn't go according to plan, he felt the world was falling apart. He thought this was strength, being in charge, being prepared. But over time, life began to show him something else. One day, his company shut down unexpectedly. Another day, his girlfriend left him, saying she was tired of living like a project to be managed. And then, his father fell sick, a kind of sickness no one could fix with plans. For the first time, Daniel realized that control was just an illusion. No matter how tightly he held onto life, it slipped through his fingers like sand. He stopped sleeping. He stopped laughing. And one morning, looking in the mirror, he saw not strength, but exhaustion. So he did something strange. He packed a bag and drove without a map. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just drove, until the noise of the city faded into the sound of wind and trees. In a small coastal town, he found an old guest house. The owner, an elderly man named Eli, smiled and said, "Rooms are cheap if you don't need Wi-Fi." Daniel stayed. The first few days, his mind screamed, "You're wasting time." But slowly, the quiet began to speak louder than his thoughts. He started walking by the ocean every morning. At first, he tried to time his steps, count his breaths. But the waves didn't care. They came and went in perfect rhythm without control. Eli once joined him on a walk and said, "The sea never asks where the wind comes from. It just moves with it." Daniel smiled politely, but the words stayed. Days turned into weeks, and something began to change inside him. The more he stopped fighting life, the lighter he felt. He started sketching again, something he hadn't done since college. He helped Eli fix things around the guest house. He learned how to sit still. One morning, he woke up early before sunrise. The sky was still pale, quiet, waiting. He took his coffee and sat by the shore. The waves were calm, the horizon endless. He whispered, almost without meaning to, "I don't need to control this." And in that moment, something clicked. For the first time in years, he felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because he stopped demanding that it should be. He realized that control had never been strength. It had been fear of loss, fear of uncertainty, fear of life itself. And letting go wasn't weakness. It was trust. When Daniel finally returned home, nothing had really changed. The city was still loud. The people were still rushing. But he was different. He didn't chase anymore. He didn't need to know what tomorrow would bring. He just lived, fully, quietly, and freely. And when people asked what had happened, he said, "I stopped trying to control the ocean." Months later, he visited his father again. The illness had slowed him down, but there was still warmth in his smile. They sat together in silence. No plans, no goals, just presence. His father said softly, "You seem happier, son." Daniel smiled. "I think I finally understand what peace means." Years passed. Daniel opened a small art studio in that same coastal town. He painted waves, skies, and quiet mornings. And every time someone asked what his art meant, he would say, "It's about the beauty of things we can't control." And maybe that's what life is all about. Not mastering it, not planning it to perfection, but dancing with it, as it flows in its own mysterious rhythm. The tides rise and fall. The wind changes direction. People come and go. And through it all, the heart learns to breathe again. So if you ever feel like life is slipping away from your grip, remember, it's not your job to control the waves. It's your job to learn how to float. Let go. Trust the current. Because peace doesn't begin when everything is under control. It begins when you finally stop trying to control it. Years after Daniel had settled in the quiet coastal town, the sea changed again. It was autumn, the kind that came with silver skies and the smell of rain in the air. One evening, the horizon grew dark, and a storm began to form. It wasn't gentle or graceful. It was fierce, alive, and unrestrained. The kind of storm that reminded you how small you really were. Eli, the old man who once owned the guest house, had passed away the year before. Daniel had taken over the place, keeping it simple. Just a few rooms, the creak of wood, and the endless sound of waves. He painted most days, capturing the shifting moods of the sea. That night, as thunder rolled over the water and wind battered the shutters, Daniel felt something stirring deep inside. Something old, something familiar. The voice. What if the roof leaks? What if the power goes out? What if the tide rises too high? It was the same voice that had once ruled his life, the voice of control, of fear disguised as order. He stood still for a moment, listening to the storm and the whispering voice within him. Then slowly he smiled. "I know you," he said quietly, "but I don't need you anymore." He picked up a lantern and stepped outside. Rain lashed against his face. The wind nearly stole his breath. The sea roared like a living creature, wild and untamed. He walked barefoot through the sand until he stood right at the edge of the surf. Lightning split the sky, lighting everything in silver for a heartbeat. The waves, the cliffs, his silhouette. And he laughed. Not from madness, but from recognition. The storm wasn't his enemy. It was life, raw, powerful, uncontrollable. "I'm not here to stop you," he whispered to the waves. "I'm here to meet you." At that moment, something shifted. The storm was no longer outside of him, it was him. The fear, the movement, the freedom. When morning finally came, the world smelled of salt and new beginnings. The beach was littered with branches and seaweed. The boats were pulled onto the sand, and yet everything felt strangely clean. Daniel stood by the calm water, the sea once again gentle and endless, and whispered to himself, "Peace isn't the absence of storms. It's standing in them and staying open." In the days that followed, Daniel began painting again. But this time he didn't paint quiet seas or still skies. He painted storms, canvas after canvas, waves crashing, winds bending trees, lightning splitting clouds. The energy poured out of him like the storm itself had moved into his hands. People who visited the small gallery he'd built near the guest house often stood silently before his work. The paintings seemed alive. You could almost hear the wind in them, almost feel the rain. When they asked him what inspired the series, Daniel would simply smile and say, "Because even the storm is beautiful when you stop trying to control it." He no longer searched for meaning or order in every brushstroke. He simply painted what he felt, the flow, the chaos, the grace. Sometimes he would walk along the beach and find pieces of driftwood washed up by the tides. He started carving them into small sculptures, waves frozen in motion, or human figures with their faces turned to the wind. It was never about perfection. It was about truth, the same truth he'd found in the storm, that life wasn't meant to be tamed. Years later, on a quiet spring evening, a young traveler arrived at the guest house. He looked tired, restless, the kind of tired that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul. He checked his phone every few minutes, adjusting his plans, muttering about schedules. Daniel recognized that look. He had worn it once. That night, as the wind calmed and the moonlight stretched across the sea, Daniel invited the traveler to walk with him to the shore. They stood there for a while, listening to the gentle crash of waves. The young man finally sighed and said, "I feel like I'm always behind. No matter how hard I try, I can't catch up." Daniel smiled softly. "Maybe you're not supposed to." The traveler frowned. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Daniel looked out at the horizon. "Do you know what the ocean taught me?" The young man shook his head. "That you don't have to fight the current to find your way home." They stood there in silence for a while, the words hanging in the air like salt. The boy didn't understand it yet, but Daniel knew that one day he would. Months later, Daniel saw the traveler's name on a postcard that arrived at the guest house. It showed a painting of a wave, bold, free, unrestrained. On the back, just a single line, "I stopped fighting the current. Thank you." Daniel smiled. He placed the postcard on the windowsill beside his sketches. The sea outside shimmered under the morning light, endlessly moving, endlessly changing. He realized then that wisdom didn't travel in lessons or words. It moved quietly, from one heart to another, like the tide. And as the waves whispered their rhythm against the sand, Daniel closed his eyes and breathed. Not to control, not to resist, but simply to belong. Because life would always bring its storms. And peace would always come, not when the sea was calm, but when he remembered that he had learned how